Hello, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. And I'm turning on lights because it's very cloudy and rainy and dark outside. Um, this is the This Is Not Therapy Hour. This is just an open conversation. That's it. I'm just here and I'm available for whatever interest or value that has to anybody. I'm here and we're having a conversation. I'm going to talk about stuff, and that stuff theoretically, hopefully, has some impact on you. And if you are in the chat today, then the things that you say and do in the chat will have an impact on me. And yes, that can be questions and answers, or it can just be responses, or it can be a conversation. It's just what communication is. We'll go where we go. I run a practice called Effective Artistry. That's our fun logo in the corner. We provide individual and relationship counseling, as well as executive functioning coaching. We are in the process of developing a bunch of cool, fun groups, which is fun and sometimes stressful. Check us out if you're interested. We focus, our specialty is, we probably, if you're here, you probably know, we focus on executive functioning and neurodiversity, among other things. It's kind of more about our approach. Yeah, every week I pick something to start with, just because it's easier to get a conversation going instead of having to wait for somebody to be the first person to say something in the chat. So I'm not just sitting here in silence. Not a strong suit of mine, being quiet when there's nothing going on. This week we had a specific topic requested, and so I'll start by talking about that in a minute. But just so that you know, if you're in the chat, we don't have to stick on the things that we started by talking about. We'll go where we go. If that has more to do with the kind of stuff we're already talking about, great. If it takes us elsewhere, great. The people who are here are the ones that matter the most, even though there's probably other people who would like to be here and can't. What am I supposed to? I don't know if that might be the case or not, or what they would prefer. So we focus on the people who are here. If you're watching, that's great. It's even better for me anyway, if you're in the chat. If you're on Facebook and you chat something, it'll come through your Facebook account. Your Facebook account will be labeled on it. If you're on YouTube and you chat, it'll be your Google account. If you're on Twitch, it'll be your Twitch account. Just keep that in mind. I try not to read off any names of people saying stuff, just because I don't know who cares about what. But even if I don't, got distracted. Even if I don't read off any names, those things are still attached to these videos as they stay up on YouTube and whatever. So take that into consideration. I think that's everything. I'm never confident that it is everything that I need to say at the beginning, but I think that it is, or at least about everything. So here's the question that I got this week, a very specific and practical one, which I love. I love practical questions. I talk a lot about like big, vague, general philosophical things because that stuff is more applicable across the board. The more general something is, the more frequently it is applicable to something. And conversely, the less impact it has in each instance to which it applies, because it is general, which means it had to lose a lot of the information about anything specific and detailed in order to be relevant so often. Same, the other thing is true in reverse of specific. The more specific, the more of an impact it has to the cases to which it applies, but the less frequently it applies. In this case, we got the question, a lot of people have been struggling with to-do lists and budgeting time and energy and other resources, and then what to do or what happens when something that you budgeted some resources for ends up taking a lot more than you thought it was going to. So I'm going to but I'm going to say some things first that I have said before, just in case I don't know who's paying attention over time or whatever. But number one, if you're going to be writing things down outside of your head, so first of all, this is something we call offloading. Executive functioning is a cognitive thing. It's stuff that the brain does. So anything that you're doing outside of yourself, lists, planners, organizational systems, notes, whatever, that stuff is called offloading. Sometimes we call it strategies, executive functioning strategies. Mostly people just refer to it as executive functioning because it offloads some of the work that the cognitive element of executive functioning would have to be doing otherwise. In other words, I can remember something which takes up room in my working memory, or I can write it down somewhere, and then all I have to remember is where I wrote it down, which takes up less room. So I'm offloading some of that resource expenditure. I think when we're talking about to-do lists and planners, those kinds of things, it's important to know that we're trying to accomplish different purposes with these things. And a lot of the time people don't delineate that, don't distinguish what we're trying to do, and just think that we're supposed to have one thing that covers all this stuff. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. So some of those things. Two that I think most people are pretty aware of, and I don't think they separate them, but one is to remember stuff. This is the traditional to-do list, right? That, I had an idea, or there's something I need to do later. I want to remember it. So I'm putting it down just so that I'm storing that information externally somewhere. Another is to plan, to prioritize, to allocate resources. And that's more of the calendar or the schedule. That's interesting. I'll come back to that in a second. You can do systems that do both of those things, both help remind you and also make determinations about what things are most worth your resources and how much they're going to take, and et cetera. An important third thing that this does that people tend to lose track of is just getting things organized, meaning getting your thoughts organized. Sometimes when you're making a to-do list, it serves the purpose of everything is so jumbled and everything's affecting everything, and I'm losing track and feeling overwhelmed. So I just need to get it down on paper, because the process of getting it on paper and reading it and the physical element of that allows me to be more clear about making decisions and figuring out what's worth remembering and what I can let go of, etc. And if I never look at that list again, doesn't matter. It still fulfilled that purpose of organizing things. I think that one in particular is tough for people sometimes, because they think the point is to keep using the to-do list, crossing things off. And that's helpful in that first way, but it could be that you're doing it just to be getting that help, the organizational help. So let me address the comment here. Got an entire technical manual printed and bound because I have to keep referencing it, and for some reason having it physically outside of my computer feels like offloading to me. Having to reference it on my computer feels like having another tab open. I don't know how common it is to feel like computer tabs directly reflect your mental state. I don't know how common that is, or how, what level of, test retest validity or whatever that has, but it's definitely something that people talk about. And it is definitely something that I have noticed, that having a lot of tabs open tends to correlate to certain experiences cognitively and emotionally. I don't think because one causes the other. I think there's probably some common denominators in many cases. Feeling like I don't have the ability to look at this thing or do this thing right now, but I do think it might be important later, so let me hold on to it. And of course, nobody ever goes back and actually looks at all those tabs. You end up just adding more and more until something happens and they all get put away and you start over again. But that's not a bad thing. That is a version of offloading. I have in our professional, like in our work, G-chat stuff, I have a room that's just called research, that for me is whenever I come across something that I think is interesting and want to look into, but I can't look into it right then and there, I put it into the research tab. Excuse me, I don't know what my throat's doing right now. The research chat. Very, very rarely have I ever gone back there. Maybe 3 times in 2 years have I gone back there and scrolled up to find something. But at least it's indexed. I could search it. If I thought something like, oh, there was some article I came across a while back that I had wanted to read that references, I can type into the search bar and it will pull it up for me, even if it was a year and a half ago. So I don't have to waste my time looking through. A lot of working memory issues, by the way, are very much related to this idea that I can't put this away yet. I can't let go of it, because if I do, I'm not sure that I'll ever be able to find it again. It seems like it might be impossible to do that, or very costly to do that. But I also don't have the resources right now to explore and get the value out of it that I think is there, or determine that it isn't actually as valuable as I think that it is. So I just kind of hang on to it. And it takes less resources, it takes less space in working memory, but it takes some. And a lot of what's happening when people feel like they're getting overwhelmed is just there's finite space in working memory, which is awareness, consciousness, whatever you want to call it. It's the cognitive space where you can hold information that you can manipulate. anything that you're thinking of, noticing, observing, anything you can do something with is in there. And there's only so much room. So when new stuff comes in, something gets bumped out. Mostly those things just get lost and forgotten. Sometimes they get processed into long-term memory for later retrieval, but that's a very small minority of that stuff. That's happening constantly all the time, constantly. A lot of time what's happening when people are feeling overwhelmed is just that all of that stuff you have identified as still has value that I haven't been able to get out of it yet. In other words, it still feels important. So something's going to get bumped out because I can't be aware of all of it, but all of it feels important. So I'm going to feel the stress at losing any of it. We can talk more about that, but tried to organize tabs, finally settled on if there's something I can't close because I'm stuck on how much I want to come back to it, I PDF it and put it in Dropbox, at least in its file. Yeah. It's actually a great example, a great metaphor of offloading. And yes, having a physical manual printed off and kept next to your desk or next to your computer rather than on the computer itself, obviously not going to work for everybody all the time, but it is working for you. It is offloading. It's making it easier for you for whatever reason to reference that information. I don't know if you've got tabs and, you know, things sticking out the side so that you can quickly get to the page that you need to get to, but having it in a separate visual field than the work that you're doing means that, and of course people have dual monitors or other setups that allow this too, but the work I'm doing can stay here and I reference this over here and I don't have to keep switching back and forth in terms of, you know, closing it or minimizing it and then pulling it back up or switching from one tab to the next. That's my biggest thing. I don't care if people have a lot of tabs open. There's no problem with that, except when I'm trying to find one of those tabs that I need. And when I've seen this with clients, they've always said, yeah, I know which one it is. I can find it. And of course they can, but it's harder. And I don't mean, oh, it takes me 2 minutes instead of takes me a second. I mean that even if it's a microscopic amount of time, it's a lot of processing. It's a lot of attention. It's a lot of awareness that has to be dedicated to which of these, that one. Speed is not always what we care about. So back to the original question, what if things on your list take more resources than you expected them? Well, so we're talking now about two things. One is the to-do list, meaning here are the things that I need to get done. I'm trying to remember them. One is the schedule. These things I need to get done. This is my plan of how I'm going to allocate my resources for that. So number one, people tend to overfocus on time. Time is really not the most useful resource to try to manage. People talk about time management. I'm not managing my time well. You can't spend time, right? Nothing you do eliminates time from you. You can't conserve it, save it up so that I can spend more of it later. It's not a resource that you can manage. It's just time moves on. What we mean is that there are other things that limit our ability of how much we can do in a given moment. So how are we allocating those resources as time passes? And that's like, I know probably sounds like splitting hairs, but it matters. It matters because time is way, way easier to observe and discuss than the other resources we're going to talk about today. Energy, attention, awareness. Awareness, just a faster way of saying working memory. I have a clock on my wall there. We collectively have easy language to reference the fact that it is, my clock is wrong, I'm realizing, that it is 1:16, and we all know what that means. We can say 5 minutes and we know what that means. I have another clock right over here. We can observe time very easily. Anybody notice how much people are complaining about the rise in gas prices, but not nearly as much complaints about the rise in all the other prices that are going up? Well, which price has a giant blaring glowing red sign or white sign or whatever every few blocks that you drive? Which one are you more aware of? Which one is it easier to be aware of? So people tend to focus on time. That's not usually the most useful resource to take a look at. We'll still use it, but usually it's more energy. If you're going to try and budget things out, energy is the one that I find has more utility. And that still contains, like, that's within a bucket of time, right? So I'm saying if I got to do this thing first thing I'm going to do if I'm making a plan, not just a to-do list to remember stuff, but I'm actually trying to plan and prioritize and allocate resources. First thing I'm going to do is say, how much time do I think this will take? And you make a guess. The best thing that you can do is write that guess down. And then when the thing actually comes and you actually do it, write down how much time it actually took. You will never, ever, ever, this not, you might, but very, very rarely are you ever going to be able to say, it will take me exactly this long and it takes you exactly that long. We're trying to kind of get rough estimates. And the only way for your estimates to get better, because people will say things like, I consistently under budget my time. I consistently think it will take me 10 minutes to get out of the house, but it takes me 30 and I'm 20 minutes late wherever I was going. If that's the case, you'll find that out pretty quickly and clearly if you're writing down or storing somewhere your guess about how much it will take and then recording how much it actually took. Does that help in the particular moment? No, not at all. But that helps over time so that your guesstimates of what something is going to take from you should theoretically become more and more accurate over time. The best thing you can do to get yourself to do that process is to know that it doesn't matter whether you're right or not. People get stuck because they're like, it could take 15 minutes. It could take 45 minutes. I don't know. Yeah, you don't know. And there's no amount of thinking that you can do in that moment that's going to reveal the answer to you. So you're just getting stuck and not doing anything. You just pick maybe 15, maybe 45. I don't know. I guess I'll say 15. And then you'll find out. And the next time you'll feel more confident and able to make a guess faster. Now, I'm going to try and answer the question as it was posed, which was focused on time and energy, but primarily time. It takes more time than I thought. If I have budgeted things out and something is taking me more time than I thought it would, and that's causing me a problem, what that means is I have budgeted my time, like I've gotten every last piece of it budgeted, right? That the additional time that this thing is taking me to do, I didn't have that to spare. And again, this isn't going to be helpful in the moment when the thing is happening, but it does help moving on, with what goes in the future, is to take a look at, wow, that thing took me 2 hours more than I thought it would, and it ruined my whole day. So I don't have 2 spare hours baked into my day anywhere. That's probably an issue. How much you're trying to accomplish, given the resources that you have available to spend, is probably an issue if this stuff is going on consistently. It's not just about your guesses. Part of the reason that you might consistently guess that something will take less time than it actually ends up taking is because you're trying to fit an inappropriate amount of tasks into that time. In other words, if I need to do these 10 things and they're all important and I can't cut any of them, then I'm going to, but these 10 things all need to be done in the next 24 hours. And based on my guesses, it's going to take 24 hours total, throw 6 hours of sleep in there or whatever. I've got to max it out, budget my time. I'm incentivized to look at some of those things and say, yeah, I can get this done in a half hour and fit it into the budget, rather than saying, I can't get all these things done. How do I choose what to get rid of? So that's a big part of the reason. It's not just that you don't know how long something will take. We never do. If you're consistently underestimating, it might be because you're trying to fit more in than is actually possible. And you just have been unable or unwilling or whatever to address the fact that you're trying to do more than is possible to do. So take a look at that. In the moment, all you can do is decide what to cut. If I budgeted an hour for this thing and I'm now at an hour and 15 on it, and I don't have 15 minutes to spare, I needed to move on to my next thing based on my guess of how long it will take and whatever, then I have to make a decision. Do I just call this thing done, even though I wouldn't otherwise because I have to move on? Or do I look at my list and cut something else? That's really, really, really hard to do in the moment, because you wouldn't be facing that decision of what to cut if you weren't already overwhelmed, right? Nobody's jumping straight to, oh, I better cut something. It's usually, I can do it. Crap, I can't. Like, I literally can't. This is terrible. I've tried everything. I can't do it. You're in distress, making decisions, prioritizing, a lot of the things that we traditionally call executive functioning, which are correlated with electrical activity in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And the prefrontal cortex isn't working that much at that point. Electrical activity in that region of the brain is decreased when you're experiencing that distress. It's hard. So you got to set yourself up well to make it as easy as possible if it comes to that. You have contingency plans. So things like, if this ends up taking, I think it'll take this, but if it ends up taking this, then what do I do? You decide in advance outside of the moment. A more generic kind of like cover all your bases way to approach that is that you make the to-do list first. Here are all the things that I need to get done. You make your guesses about how much time, how much energy, we'll talk about energy, it's going to take you to do those things. And then before you schedule them, before you map them to a particular time, you prioritize them. Imagine I could only get one of these things done. Which one would that be? That now goes at the top of the list. Of what's remaining, imagine I could get one more thing done, but nothing else. What would that be? That's second, and so on and so forth. If that is a hard thing for you to do, because especially when there's a lot of things and they all seem important, it can be really hard to say which one is most important. Notice, by the way, I didn't say which is most important, because that's like an impossible question. Which is most important? I can come up with ways that they're all important, or I wouldn't have written them down. I said, if I could only do one, hypothetically, I can only do one of these things, which would it be? Because I'm trying to force a decision. That still might be very difficult to do. This other way that I'm about to recommend takes more time, but is much easier cognitively, is you use a single elimination tournament bracket. Most commonly, people know those as March Madness brackets. And you just write down all the different things on your to-do list, and you do it one game at a time. Okay, I can only do this or this. Which one would I want? That one advances to the next round. I can only do this or this, until you end up with just one. The problem with that, the reason that it takes so long, is because that only gets you the top priority. Because since we didn't seed it well, it's possible that priority number 1 and priority number 2 went up against each other in the first round. So we can't just work backwards. So that just gives me my top priority. And then if I need to get the second one, then I got to do the process again without the first thing. And yes, then the question is going to come up, well, wouldn't it be more efficient to just seed them to decide what is the 1 seed and what's the 8 seed? Sure, except how do you do that? And as soon as you start trying to do that, you're probably getting paralyzed again. The point is that we're trying to force decisions so that you can go fast. So if you do those things ahead of time, before you make the schedule, you say, these are the things that are most important. Then you make the plan or the schedule of when you're going to do those things. You're allocating your resources. That way, when the time comes and something's ended up taking a lot longer than you thought it was going to take, then you can say, okay, well, this thing I'm doing right now is actually only my 4th priority. I'm doing it now because it was, needed to be done during business hours, and the other stuff can be done later or whatever. But will I still be able to do everything above this on the list if I keep going with this? If so, then I'll keep going. If not, then I'm going to stop, because I need to focus on those things above. I'm not going to say, will I still be able to do all the things below this on the list? Because I might or I might not. But what does it matter? If I can only get either this or that other stuff done, well, this is a higher priority. And yes, generic. There are times where it's like, okay, I could just do this and not get the other 8 things done, even though this is the most important. I'd rather get all the other 8 things done instead of, there's flexibility. We're just trying to make it as easy as possible ahead of time. One of my rules that I've said a lot is these things are tools, not taskmasters. The plan that you made, the to-do list that you came up with, whatever, that's not a requirement. That's not an assignment that has been given to you with specific criteria. And if you don't meet the criteria, you have in some way failed. You are in some way deficient. These are tools that you made up. You came up with the list. You came up with the plan. Somehow people get stuck because we have put it onto the intermediary of our phone or the paper or whatever, that we forget that this was just our idea of what might happen or what would be best. If we remembered that part when the time came and we were supposed to, sorry about that. If I planned on doing something at 7 o'clock and 7 o'clock rolled around and I wasn't doing it, then I would just say, oh, I guessed when I made this up, I made a guess that 7:00 would be a good time for me to do it. Turns out I was wrong, because we're pretty comfortable with us being wrong. But we forget about that. We say the plan says I'm supposed to do it at 7. So since I'm not doing it at 7, I am failing. I should do what the plan says. You made up the plan. Any plan is your past self's best guess about what was going to work out well. If it does, good job. If it doesn't, still, good guess, past self. You did your best, but I have more information than you did. When you made this plan this morning, 8 a.m., Brandon, you thought that at 7 p.m. you would have the energy necessary to do this thing. Well, now it's 7 p.m. and I can tell you definitively, I don't have the energy to do this thing. So the guess was wrong. So now I got to make a new guess. Instead of feeling like a failure and getting in my head, like, no, I've got to do it, which is incredibly inefficient. I just say, okay, it's not working. When do I want to do it instead? And that might be, okay, I'm going to set a 20-minute timer, and when that goes off, I'll come do it. Or it might be, no, I'm moving this to tomorrow or next week. Or it might be, you know what? I'm just not going to do this thing. But if I get obsessed with the idea that I have failed in some way because I didn't follow through on my plan, as though the plan is somehow flawless, then we get into all kinds of other stuff. What's wrong with me? Why am I doing it? And it just drains all the resources and nothing gets done anyway. I'm trying to track where I'm at. So you want to set it up in advance to make it as easy as possible for you to access the information that you would want, like priority and how much it takes and whatever. So that if you have to make cuts, you make cuts. If you're consistent, we talked about that. If you're consistently under. Okay, so let's talk about energy. I find it much more useful to budget energy than time. The reason that we don't do that is because I don't have an energy clock that I can point at. I can't even very clearly define what energy is, and neither can you or anybody else. All we know is, I'm talking about anecdotally, viscerally, what the lived experience. I'm not talking about like the biology or whatever. All we as individuals know is there is some pool of some resource that we have to draw on in order to do certain things. And that pool can shrink as things get expended, and it can grow as things restore that energy or whatever. We call that energy. Even more specifically, and again, this is anecdotal, but we all have this experience of there seem to be different kinds of energy in some kind of a way, right? That there are times that my body is exhausted and I don't want to move, but my brain has plenty of energy and I want to be thinking about stuff. There are times where I don't want to think. I can barely turn my brain on at all, but my body is doing just fine moving, right? And you can break it up in whatever ways are useful to you. I have kind of settled on a balance of 4 ways of breaking it up. So I'll share that with you, but you can do it in whatever way you like. Because it's not like these things are definitively and objectively, determined. It's just how I find it useful to break it up. I think of it as what I call global energy. And by that, I mean tiredness, that I need sleep. I need, that no matter what I'm trying to do, it's harder if I have less of this and easier if I have more of this. And for me, that mostly equates to sleep. What am I eating or drinking? That's more or less it. I've noticed some correlations for myself with physical activity or medication. I take my ADHD meds and that seems to affect some things there, but it's different for everybody. So that's global or organic, sometimes I'll call it. Then I talk about physical for myself, physical energy, which is specifically like skeletal muscular stuff. Like if I worked out and my muscles are sore and I don't want to be moving or lifting things, I might be low on that, but not tired in the sense that I want to sleep. Cognitive energy, which is like intense intellectual tasks, trying to do math in my head or, have a very academic conversation with somebody. And then emotional energy, something that even if it's not very intellectually challenging or physically challenging, it just takes a lot. The idea of, man, we got to talk about that thing. I don't want to talk about that thing right now. Happy to talk about theoretical physics. I can talk. I just don't want to talk about something that has a lot of emotion attached to it right now. That's how I like. However you like to split it up, or not at all, and you can just call it energy, you have to come up with your own way of tracking it, because we don't have a clock for energy. We don't have shared language on, oh, I can tell you this thing took me about an hour and you know what I mean. I can't say this thing took me about 20 points of energy and you know what I mean. That doesn't mean it's not useful to be able to track and scale and budget those things. It just means we don't do it a lot because we can't really talk about it with each other. If you tell me you're struggling with something and you want my help, I'm probably going to ask about time, because I understand that. I'm looking at that. I'm probably not going to say, well, how much of your energy did you spend on it? Because how are we supposed to discuss that? Yeah, spell slots is one we've talked about in the past. This thing took me 2 level 3 spell slots, which is great, although you'd have to specify what level of a caster you are so that I know proportionately how much of your resources that is. Because that's all that matters, is proportionality. It isn't an objective thing. It is observable. Emotion, for example, is observable. I am happy is something I'm observing about myself. But other people can't also observe it and come to the same conclusion independent of what I am telling them. So it's not empirical. It's not objective. It is observable. But what we're focused on is I want it to be clear what proportion of my resources it's taking. For me, the easiest way to do that is scale 1 to 100. I just call it points. I visualize the mana orb, and I don't know why, because I've never been big on the Diablo games, but for some reason that image works better for me here, that it's like an orb with liquid in it, and as you expend stuff, that liquid kind of drops, and as you recover, the liquid goes back up. And at the top it's 100, I've got it all, and at the bottom it's 0. And Ironstone, I don't know if that's pronounced Ironstone. I don't know how I've ever said it out loud. Yeah, doesn't matter how you visualize it. Doesn't matter what scale you want. You just need something to be able to consistently carry the information forward. Without language, you don't really have a good way to carry data from one context to the next, right? If you don't know the word scarlet and the word crimson and have specific connections, I know those words, but I don't have specific connections to visual information about them. So if you show me a red, I'm not going to be able to say whether that's a scarlet or a crimson red. And if I'm looking at that red and you can tell me, hey, tomorrow I'm going to put 2 reds in front of you, and you got to tell me which one is this one, I'm not going to be able to. But if I do know the word scarlet and crimson and connect it to a specific thing, and you do that same task, here's a red, I want you to remember it, and tomorrow I'm going to give you 2 options, one of which is this and one is another thing, and well, then I can just say, oh, well, that's easy, this is crimson, so tomorrow I'll look for the crimson one. So we want language for it so that we can carry things around and compare it. So I start with 1 to 100 points of energy, and I budget everything from there. And it's all made up. I make guesses. I think this is going to take like 10 points of my energy. I think this is going to take 50 points of energy. I think this thing's going to take me like 2 points of energy per 5 minutes that I'm spending on it, etc. I think the most helpful thing to do is to just start there. I'll give the full, what I think is optimal, but I don't know anybody that's ever just jumped in. You just take pieces of it and do whatever's helpful. So first you scale it, then you start checking in with your current reserves. Don't worry about budgeting or anything like that. Just start saying, out of 100, how much energy do I have right now? Where is my pool of resources? Easiest to do is probably every morning, because that's when we tend to think of it as being reset, even though energy doesn't reset, it just goes up and down. But it's practical and useful to separate it into days. So in the morning, I wake up and say, okay, I got 70 points of energy out of the 100 that I usually have, or the 100 that I would optimally have, on my best days. Another day I'm going to wake up and be like, wow, I have my full 100 points of energy right now. This is great. Sometimes you're going to think, wow, this is 100 points of energy. And then you have another experience where you're like, nope, this is even more. And then you change your scale. It's a scale you're making up. So you start with that, because that will mean that you'll automatically start observing correlations between the days where I wake up with more energy, the days where I wake up with less energy. Without me or anybody having to prompt you to do anything, your brain is automatically going to say, well, 100 points is better than 70, so what is it that's happening? And you start getting to play around with stuff. From there, it becomes very helpful to start making guesses in terms of budgeting. I think this thing will take me about 20 points of energy. Just like we talked about with the time, most useful thing is to put down your guess. It's a guess. It's made up. Don't worry about getting it right. Just what's your first thought? I think it'll be about 20. Okay, 20. And then when you do the thing, you observe at the beginning, where am I at energy-wise? And when you finish, you say, where am I at energy-wise? Okay, that took about, and you write it down so that your guesses become more consistent and more accurate over time. It will always fluctuate. It's not a hard science. It's just useful language for you to use. So that can be useful. And now you're experimenting with correlations to try and get more energy, like globally, total. Now you're experimenting with how much energy does a thing take and where can I budget these things. The next thing that I would recommend to somebody is that you start looking at getting energy returned to you. That's why I think it's more useful to talk about energy management than time management, because I can't influence the rate at which time passes. I can conserve energy for later. I can spend a lot of energy very rapidly on something that's very intensive to do. I can focus on doing things that restores energy to me. So that is a resource I can actually manage. It's not just a thing that happens while I'm doing stuff. I have about 15 out of 100 points of energy today. Well, too bad you have 8 hours of creative writing to do today, so you're just going to have to make it work. See, this is, I know that's a joke, but I like that as an example of the kinds of magical thinking that people get stuck on, as though there's something you can do to just make it work. No, either you'll work for 8 hours on the creative writing, but only spend 15 points of energy over that time, which means it's probably going to not be your best work. Or you'll make an adjustment and adjust the time that you're saying you're supposed to spend on it to match the energy that you have available. Or you'll do what you need to do, and this is very common. This is usually what happens. You'll do what you need to do to restore energy as you go along in order to kind of get through the 8 hours. But if you're approaching it this way, I just got to make it work, then you're probably going to be judging yourself for doing those things. I keep getting distracted. Distraction isn't a thing. I don't mean that there's never anything that pulls your focus away from something you're trying to focus on. I mean that your attention goes to things for reasons. It's not detrimental. This thing isn't bad and pulling my attention away. It's my brain is determining there's something there that is worth paying attention to. Sometimes that's because it's restful. Sometimes I can say all I want. Well, I got 15 points of energy, but I got to work for 8 hours. And that 15 points of energy is going to get me through about an hour of it. And now I got to stop and go do something that brings energy back. It's not something you get to choose. That magical thinking that you can just choose to spend resources that you don't have. That's not how it works. You can't just power through. There is something I like to call soft limits versus hard limits. Soft limits are, if I stay within these bounds, I can do this sustainably. It doesn't damage me or take excess resources in some kind of a way that I'm going to have to make up for later. It doesn't make things get worse and worse over time. I can do this forever. I can pass those soft limits. And I think this is, I distinguish these two things because I want people to know that there are things that you can push past and things that you can't. People tend to think you can push past whatever, and you just can't. So pushing past your soft limits, okay, yeah, you can do that. You're borrowing from the future. And ideally, if you're going to have to do that, you want to make a plan for how you're going to make up for it, how you're going to recover, pay that debt later on, right? A lot of the time we don't do that. We don't have the opportunity. We wouldn't be pushing past our limits if we had the time to sit back and make a plan like that. So we just kind of go and hope that at some point later on, we're able to. You will stop. You will rest. You might be able to make some choices about that. You might be able to budget in, okay, I'm going to take a break this day and just focus on doing this thing that helps me rest and recover. If you don't do that, if you don't plan it, if you don't choose it and control it, it's going to happen anyway. You just won't be in control of when and how it happens. And I'm not trying to make some blanket statement about like all medical issues fall under the category of you've been pushing harder than is sustainable. I don't mean that at all. But certainly that is an element of it. How many medical issues, physical issues do we have officially in the research? It's impacted by stress. It's made worse by stress. It's brought on by stress. Well, what do you think stress means? You are pushing yourself past your soft limits. It's unsustainable, and you're doing it for too long without recovering to the point where your body is cutting off the option for you. You are going to rest now. You're going to get a migraine now, so that you have to sit in bed and do all this other stuff, turn off the lights and whatever. You're going to fall asleep. I don't care if you're at school, you're going to fall asleep now, right? There are things that we can push past and things that we can't. So I don't want people to get stuck on this magical thinking of, if only I blank, blank, blank. There's not always an answer. Sometimes people fail and it sucks and we want to avoid it, but it does also happen. So it's just more useful to deal with the reality of it, of what the actual constraints are, rather than think, well, if only I just felt differently or thought differently or whatever, then it would work. Well, cool, but you don't. So what are we talking about here? Right? That's like saying, well, if I was 10 feet tall, I could reach that thing. Great, theoretically true. What is that supposed to do for you? It's not useful. If you wake up and you have 15 points of energy and you're supposed to do 8 hours worth of work, this is why I don't like measuring it by time, especially, by the way, creative writing. If you're an artist of any kind, like trying to be consistent about any kind of creative work, or just your work generally, your job or anything is about knowledge and information, that the value that you bring isn't in the stuff that your body does so much as it is in the stuff that you know and come up with and how you solve problems. If that's the stuff that you do, if that's the stuff you're focused on, please don't try to measure anything based on time. It's a terrible metric to use. You should not be trying to force yourself to do anything for a certain length of time. That's not how that process works. All you're doing is making yourself sit there staring at a blank screen. It won't happen anyway. You'll just be sitting there miserable instead of engaging in the things that might actually help you recover some energy so that you can move forward. Distraction, more often than not, it's just because you don't have the resources you need to do whatever thing you're trying to focus on doing. A lot of the time that's energy, and the distraction is something that is energizing to you and you can come back to it. But sometimes it's just, I don't know how to do this thing. So the distraction doesn't enable me to come back and do it, but it's just what I'm doing instead because I don't know how to do this thing anyway. Budget your energy, not your time. Please. This is like my big thing to everybody. Make your guesses, blah, 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 different categories. Oh, yeah. So the next step after making guesses about how much will take and recording how much it actually takes, the next step after that is to focus on how you recover energy. What things can you do to get energy back? On the organic level, the global level, as far as I'm aware, and I'm just making this stuff up, so I'm happy to hear anybody else's thoughts. As far as I'm aware, I've got 5 categories that I think are worth looking at: sleep, diet, physical activity, chemicals, and medical issues. And yes, there's overlap and there's Venn diagrams. I just find it useful to have these categorizations. Sleep doesn't just mean amount of sleep. There's sleep quality, but it's not just that either. It's the time. I could have the same quality of sleep and the same amount of sleep. If I sleep from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m., I'm going to feel more tired the next day than if I sleep from 12 p.m. to 8 a.m. Is that right? 8 hours either way. So the time, the pattern, which, by the way, part of the reason that I don't like people budgeting time on stuff is because if I say I'm going to do something at 4 and I don't have the energy for it, and I feel bad and I'm pushing myself, oh God, what's wrong with me? I'm distracted, I'm procrastinating, I'm blah, blah, blah. And then I do it at 10 o'clock. I've been beating myself up for 6 hours. Well, as I walk away, what's my default thought going to be about what got me to do the work at 10 o'clock? I'm going to say it was me beating myself up in my head for 6 hours. The stress motivates me. The pressure motivates me. The deadline motivates me. Somehow the negative experience got me to do something. But again, we know what stress does. You can use that word to mean different things, but we know what stress does in the terms of what happens in the brain and the body. And it does not make anything easier. It makes it harder. Will it make it more valuable to you to do it? Yeah, because it's negative reinforcement. I don't like the experience of beating myself up in my head. So now doing the thing has not only the value that it had by itself, but the additional value of I get to stop beating myself up. So it is more valuable, and it might make me do it when I wouldn't have otherwise, but it also makes it more costly to do. If I'm stressed, I'm not working as efficiently. Another possibility that people often just ignore and don't look at all is that maybe at 4 p.m. you don't have whatever, call it energy, that you need in order to do the task, and at 10 p.m. you do. Maybe because of some biological rhythm, maybe because of the structure of your day and when you eat and when you drink, and et cetera, et cetera. Maybe because, this is one of my personal favorite ways to think of it for myself, maybe because you are sensitive to social data. So if other people are around, even if they're not in front of me, if they're just awake and I'm aware of them and thinking about what would they want me to be doing, so my resources are going to that. And then at 10 o'clock, everybody's asleep, so I don't have to think about what they would want me to be doing right now. I can just focus my resources on what. We don't have to know the why. It's all just made up stuff anyway. It's narratives that are useful, can be useful anyway, but it's still a construct. So I would say if you keep trying to do something, do your homework right at 4 after you get home from work, and it happens at 10 every night, try planning to do it at 10. See if you can plan it at 10 and not beat yourself up for 6 hours. You might not be able to, but give it a try. See if you can just say, nope, I'm just going to do it at 10 today. That's fine. I'm going to do other things between now and then, and see if you still do it at 10 anyway. And if you do, then that's pretty good evidence that it wasn't the stress that was getting things done. That the stress was just you feeling bad because you thought you should do it differently than you are doing it, even though the way you're doing it does still work. If the way you're doing it doesn't work, causes you problems in some way, then that's a different thing. I'm trying to bring in more dopamine suppliers into work. I have a tray of pretty dice at home and some fancy ink for dip pens that I can use for my coloring pages in my Heroes Journal. That's cool. Yeah, making tasks more fun is something that you can do to make it. So let me go back to that then. This is the way I find most useful to talk about restoring energy. There's those 5 categories, and note, when I say sleep, it means more than just quality and quantity. When I say diet, it doesn't mean I got to eat more healthy stuff and less unhealthy stuff, or eat at a certain, it just means what are you eating and when. Maybe that's worth looking at changing. Different people do it differently. In fact, one thing that we see with some consistency, it shows up in the research, is that people with ADHD eat a lot of sugar and a lot of carbs, especially late at night, and somehow that helps them to go to sleep better than it would otherwise. Or caffeine helps them to go to sleep better. Different people's bodies react differently to different things. I said physical activity, not exercise, because exercise isn't always good. Sometimes it's, if I do more physical activity, that helps me. Sometimes it's I'm doing too much physical activity and I need to scale that back, or a different type of physical activity. Chemicals, the big ones that most people are focused on is caffeine, but medication, if you take medication. But drugs are in this too, illicit drugs, not just in the sense that cocaine gives you energy. I don't know, I've never done cocaine. Not just in the sense that it directly impacts energy, but it impacts how efficient it is for you to do certain things and how inefficient it is to do other things, right? Yep, that's my 10-minute warning. Navi saying, hey, listen. Chemicals, medical issues. What I mean by that usually is something that you're unaware of, that there's something going on with your body biologically that is draining your resources, and you need to address it, right? Like if you have, again, I don't know, I'm not a doctor. I'm going to just assume that if you have diabetes and you don't know and you're not managing it, that probably means that you're going to have lower energy at some point, and getting it addressed can help with that. Outside of that stuff, I really like to use the old Greek philosophical terms for things in terms of joy. I think the most useful way to talk about joy is it restores energy. What do I mean when I say I enjoy this or this is enjoyable? I mean it is giving me energy back. It is restorative or restful in some way. And that breaks down into 2 categories. One is hedonic, which means the experience is in and of itself enjoyable. regardless of anything else that I've connected it to or what's happening later or what came before. This is just enjoyable for me. For me, you know, tasty food or a nice warm bath is enjoyable. It's not because of anything. It's just the experience is enjoyable. The other is eudaimonic joy, which means joy that's based on connections, meaning I don't actually enjoy the experience of doing this thing, but I enjoy the thing that I think I'm going to get. So feeling as though I've gotten closer to that by doing this thing is enjoyable. Or I don't actually enjoy doing this thing, but I have a value, a belief that like being helpful to people is important. And even though I don't enjoy this experience in and of itself, I think it is helpful. Therefore, now I'm enjoying it because of what I'm connecting it to. The big difference in terms of energy management between those two things is eudaimonic joy, you only get when you complete the task. Hedonic joy, you get energy as you go about doing it. Eudaimonic joy, you get the energy restored to you when you've finished it. And that is arbitrary. If I say to myself, I'm going to read a chapter in my book every night, then every night when I finish a chapter, I'm going to feel good about that and get some energy. Ooh, yeah, I did that thing. We all know this, right? We don't talk about it, but when we're like, I am setting my sights on doing this thing, even though the thing itself is a terrible experience, it's very draining, but it means this other thing. And then we complete it and then you're jazzed up, right? Like, ooh, I'm so excited. You have energy. You do, you get it back. But if you start a task and don't complete it based on your arbitrary distinction. So if I say I'm going to read a chapter every night, I get the energy back every time I finish the chapter. If I say I'm going to read 7 chapters a week, then I don't get the energy back until I finish the 7th chapter. If I get energy back from every chapter, it's because I've broken it down on some level further and said, ooh, I'm making the right amount of progress towards that. So it's just another way of dividing up the goal. So that's a lot of why it's helpful when people say break something big into small chunks. There are different reasons that can be helpful. This is one of those reasons, because now I feel accomplished and therefore get energy restored to me after I've completed the chunk. Even though it's less energy comes back to me from completing the chunk than will from completing the whole thing, I need it coming in and out more. I can't just invest in getting a lot all at the end with these bigger projects. There are other reasons too, but we're talking about energy management, resource management. Energy management, restoring hedonic joy, eudaimonic joy. Eudaimonic joy, another thing about that is that you can make connections to anything. You have to believe it. You can't trick yourself. But that's what people are trying to do when they're saying, if I do this, I'll give myself a reward. You know, you could have that reward anytime, but it wouldn't be a reward. So you've made a connection. Yeah, I'll do that thing that I could just do right now, eat candy or whatever thing I want to do. But I've now labeled it as a reward. And so even if I ate the candy right now, it wouldn't feel like a reward, and therefore I wouldn't get the energy out of it than I would if I connect it to something I'm trying to do. So making things more enjoyable in either of those ways is great because it means you get your energy back. It's also important to know that doing anything, so time and energy are universal resources. Anything you do, even without any conscious input, takes time and takes energy. It doesn't consume time. You can do many, many things. My heart is pumping and my lungs are breathing all at the same time, but it has to happen over the course of a certain period of time, right? Anything you do takes that stuff. Going to bed, going to sleep takes energy. You've ever been so tired that you couldn't go to sleep? Yes. Most people have that experience at some point. I'm rushing because I got to get wrapped up in 4 minutes here. So there's one particular thing I call the float, which is I now have, my energy is so low that I can't really do anything that isn't really, really easy. These days, a lot of that is watching YouTube videos or scrolling social media or playing video, stuff that is very low energy cost and enjoyable. So as I'm spending 5 points of energy every 20 minutes, but I'm also getting back 5 points of energy every 20 minutes from the joy. It's not super fun. I'm not jazzed up about it, energized about it, but it's enough to be sustainable. So if I get that low on energy and I can't like sleep or do any of those other big things that might help me restore like organic energy, then we get into what I call the float, which is I'm doing something that is very low energy cost and returns just about the same amount of energy to me as it takes from me. So it's easy, it's basically nothing, and it's fun, but in a very minimal way. So I could do it for 6 hours, and it's not that I didn't enjoy it. I did, just not a lot, and I kind of feel gross about, I wish I had been able to do something else during some of that time, you know? So I try to put a floor on, I don't ever want to go down below that. And then when I'm budgeting, and I don't do this a lot these days because I have a very wonderful life and have been able to construct things in my environment so that it's not as big of a deal. But when I do feel like I need to budget out energy, I want to budget out both what I'm spending and what I'm getting back. That I need to, like, okay, I'm going to be at 70 here, and then I'm going to do this thing, and that takes like 30 points of energy. But if I finish it, I'll get 10 back. So then I'll be at, then I might want to take a nap because that'll give me back toward 30 points of energy. Or then I'll play a game for an hour or whatever. Why I sleep so high energy? It's frustrating. I couldn't sleep last night until I decided to just move to the couch. It's very easy for me to fall asleep on the couch. Maybe I just need to treat sleep like a nap and it'll take less energy. Yeah, we don't have time to get into that, but there's different potential answers to that. One is, and this I think is part of the reason that some people with ADHD seem to sleep better after drinking caffeine or eating sugar, is because it brings more of that interoceptive awareness. It sounds woo-woo if I try and do it really fast, but I'll try and do it really fast anyway. It makes you more aware of your body, less about thinking and more about observing. So you're feeling the tiredness and able to interact with the environment in a moment-to-moment way. The more you get in your head, the less it's finite resources. The more you're thinking, the less you're observing and interacting. The more you're observing and interacting, the less you're thinking. And some things like sleep, you don't do those things by sleeping. You do them by observing and interacting. So you need to do anything you can to shift your focus onto that stuff. Heard a lot about how that disturbs your sleep quality. Maybe. And so first of all, get a sleep tracker if you're concerned about it and see if it actually disturbs your sleep quality. Now, even if it does, that sleep quality is based on metrics involving the particular like alpha and theta brain waves that you're putting out. Really, most sleep trackers are tracking like the sounds that you're making and the movements that you're making and then correlating that to the different phases of sleep. But here's the thing, a little secret, we have no idea what the different phases of sleep do. We have lots of theories and there's evidence to support different things, but generally speaking, we don't know if someone were to just not have REM sleep, just phase 1 through 4 and never REM, we don't know what that would mean. Or if they just had 2 through REM and never had phase 1, we don't know what that would mean. For an individual, what that translates into, even if those trackers are saying you're getting poor sleep quality, if your objective if your subjective lived experience is that it is better, then it's better. The research doesn't get to supersede your own experience of a thing because research is not meant for that. Culturally, I got to get going, but I'll say this. Culturally, we got into a bit of a weird place. Research is awesome. It is so useful and so helpful for so many things. But then people started using the research to give individuals advice on what to do or not to do. There's utility there. If I'm tired and I'm sleeping 5 hours a night, how would I ever know to consider that maybe I should sleep more unless I know that other people tend to sleep more? So we want to do statistical analysis that we see that based on the metrics in the study and the subjects in the study for the duration of the study did best with about 8 hours of sleep statistically. No individual actually slept exactly 8 hours and got. So it's guidance in terms of that's worth trying because that seems to be most commonly helpful for people. It is not guidance in terms of that's how it works. You need 8 hours of sleep to feel good. You do not. Nobody sleeps exactly 8 hours. And even if you did, different days are different. Like you don't spend more energy on one day and therefore need different sleep than you might on another day. Don't worry about sleeping the right way. Worrying about sleeping the right way is a large part of what's keeping you from sleeping. If you sleep better on the couch, then sleep on the couch. If you wake up and your back is hurting from sleeping on the couch, well, okay, now you have a reason not to. But even if that's the case, it still might be better than the sleep that you would get if you went to the bed and got in your head and couldn't get yourself to sleep. All those things, we were talking about this last week, I think, with sleep, all those things that you can do, counting sheep or counting backwards or whatever, the whole point of those things is to distract your cognition to focus it on something other than trying to consciously make your body fall asleep, which interferes with the process. They're literally just things that are getting your thinking out of the way so that the body can do what it needs to do. So look at restoring budgeting in that way. If you're doing the prioritization stuff and the energy budget stuff instead of the time budget or in addition to the time budget, that makes it a lot easier to make determinations about where it's useful to get help. And remember, doing anything takes resources, including getting help, even if it's just saying, hey, can you help me? That takes something. So that's part of why I don't let myself get down, or I try not to get down past a certain floor where I get into the flow, because then I don't even have the energy to try and get help. I try and keep above that, and we don't always, which is why we all sometimes end up down in that place where we really could use some help, but we don't even know who to get it from or how or whatever. We just hope it comes along, or maybe we fall asleep at some point and the next day we do better. I got to get going. There was something I was saying before the sleep stuff that I wanted to complete, but I don't remember it. And oh well, and I got to get going. And I'll be here next week, same time, same place. So if there was something I was talking about and I'm not remembering to close it off right now, I apologize. And if you care and it matters to you, bring it up next time. Yep. Thank you all. Fun to be here. See you next week.